84%. That's how many Japanese prisoners of war expected they would be tortured and killed when they fell into American hands during World War II. Japanese women begged their families, "Please kill us quickly before the Americans arrive." 84% prepared themselves for the worst imaginable death. Eyes gouged out, ears and noses cut off, being run over by tanks while still alive. They'd been told Americans were ogre beasts, inhuman monsters who delighted in cruelty. But here's what actually happened. Those same prisoners received 2,850 calories per day. That's more than American civilians got under wartime rationing back home. They received identical medical and dental treatment to United States troops. They were paid 80 cents daily for their labor. They planted gardens. They built tennis courts. They went to movie theaters every week under guard. And they could buy Coca-Cola, beer, tobacco, and candy at the camp store. Hamburgers and Coca-Cola, not torture chambers. Meanwhile, and this is where the story gets truly disturbing, the average Tokyo resident in 1946 was surviving on 775 calories per day. That's less than 1/3 of what prisoners of war were eating in American camps. That's only 65% of minimum survival needs. People were eating beetles, beetle larvae, and insects they found at the roots of sweet potato plants. Tokyo residents failed to receive a full month's ration in 6 out of 12 months during 1946. Think about that contradiction for a moment. Japanese prisoners in American camps eating more than 3 times what Japanese civilians back home could find. The people who had been taught that surrender meant death, who literally begged to be killed quickly to avoid American torture, discovering they were safer and better fed as prisoners than their families were as free citizens in Japan. The women, who pleaded, "Kill us quickly," were instead offered hamburgers and Coca-Cola. This isn't a story about good guys and bad guys. It's far more complex and far more human than that. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through one of the most psychologically devastating ironies of World War II, how propaganda, starvation, and the collision of 2 completely different military cultures created a reality so contradictory that it broke the brains of people on both sides. You'll discover the exact propaganda terms Japanese civilians were taught to describe Americans. You'll learn about the mass civilian suicides on Okinawa, where entire families killed themselves with hand grenades to avoid capture. You'll understand the food crisis that had Japanese schoolchildren eating every part of the sweet potato plant, including the leaves and stems, just to survive. You'll explore the stark difference between Japanese prisoners in American camps and American prisoners in Japanese camps. A difference so extreme, it challenges everything we think we know about wartime conduct. And you'll see how something as simple as a Coca-Cola bottle became a symbol of a world Japanese soldiers didn't know existed. But I'm also going to show you the debates historians are having right now about what really happened during the occupation. Because some of these stories have been exaggerated, some have been understated, and separating propaganda from reality, even 80 years later, remains incredibly difficult. I spent weeks researching this topic across 51 authoritative sources, academic journals, government archives, military records, survivor testimonies, and contemporary news reports. What emerged wasn't a simple narrative. It was a deeply human story about what happens when propaganda collides with reality, when expectation meets experience, and when the people we've been taught to fear turn out to be far more complex than any slogan or military directive could capture. If you want to understand how psychological warfare actually works, how propaganda shapes reality until reality itself becomes unrecognizable, hit that like button. This video represents hundreds of hours of research into one of the most misunderstood chapters of World War II history. And if this challenges what you thought you knew about World War II, subscribe for more documentary-style investigations into the complex, uncomfortable truths that textbooks leave out. I cover historical events that challenge simple hero-villain narratives with deep research and primary sources. Let's start with a survivor. Her name isn't recorded in most historical accounts, but her testimony is preserved in multiple archives. She was a young woman on Okinawa in 1945 as American forces closed in on the island. She'd been taught her entire life what would happen if the enemy captured her. The stories were specific, visceral, designed to create absolute terror. Americans, she'd been told, would rape her, gouge out her eyes, cut off her ears and nose, and then run her over with a tank. So she did what she'd been trained to do. She begged for a hand grenade. Military personnel had been distributing grenades to civilians before the battle began, and she pleaded until someone finally gave her one. She placed it carefully in her medical kit. When the Americans came, she would pull the pin. She would die with honor. She would never be a prisoner. Everyone around her said the same thing, over and over like a mantra, never be a prisoner. But here's the twist that nobody expected. Her father had been watching. He knew what she'd done, and while she slept that night, he secretly removed the grenade from her kit. He saved her life without her knowledge, betting everything on the possibility that what they'd been told might not be true. She survived the battle. She encountered American soldiers, and she was shocked, her word, preserved in testimony, shocked at the comparatively humane treatment she received from the enemy. The ogre beasts turned out to be young men who gave her food and water, who didn't harm her, who seemed genuinely confused about why so many civilians had killed themselves. This pattern repeated thousands of times across Okinawa. Civilians who survived often expressed surprise. One Japanese officer, disguised in female clothing to avoid identification, finally told a group of hiding civilians something that contradicted everything they'd been taught. He said, and this is a direct quote from survivor testimony, "The United States Army does not kill civilians. We cannot continue to live like this. Let's surrender." But by the time that message began to spread, between 100,000 and 150,000 of Okinawa's approximately 500,000 inhabitants were already dead. Many had killed themselves and their families. Others had been killed in the crossfire. Some had been killed by Japanese soldiers who were enforcing the propaganda by force. This is the central tragedy we're exploring today. The gap between what people were told and what was true created a body count that staggers the imagination. Propaganda didn't just shape perceptions, it murdered families. It destroyed entire communities. And when the truth finally emerged, it was too late for tens of thousands of people who had acted on lies they believed were facts. Now, I need to make something clear before we go further. This video isn't propaganda in the other direction. I'm not here to tell you the American occupation was perfect or that no crimes occurred. They absolutely did. Historians are still debating the extent, and I'll walk you through those debates in detail later. What I'm going to show you is the documented, verified gap between expectation and reality, and why that gap matters for understanding how propaganda works in any era, including our own. You're going to learn about the actual policies, the actual calorie counts, the actual testimony from prisoners and civilians and soldiers on both sides. You're going to see primary sources, government documents, and cross-verified survivor accounts. And by the end of this video, you'll understand something crucial about human nature. We're all susceptible to propaganda, especially when it confirms our fears. Here's what's coming in the next 50 minutes. We'll explore the precise propaganda campaign that convinced an entire population to choose death over surrender. We'll examine the starvation crisis that made Japan desperate enough to create a brothel system to prevent mass rape. We'll compare the treatment of prisoners on both sides, using actual camp records and testimony from men who lived through both systems. We'll investigate the arrival of American consumer culture through something as simple as Coca-Cola bottling plants that were waiting off the coast of Japan before the surrender was even signed. And we'll confront the uncomfortable debates about what really happened during the occupation, debates that are still unresolved among professional historians today. This isn't comfortable history. It's not designed to make anyone feel good. It's designed to show you how psychology, propaganda, and power interact in ways that can't be reduced to simple narratives about heroes and villains. If you've ever wondered how propaganda actually works at scale, how entire populations can be convinced to act against their own survival instincts, or how truth and lies get tangled up so thoroughly that even historians can't fully separate them decades later, this video is for you. Let's dive into the machine that created this tragedy. We're starting in 1944, when the Japanese government began preparing civilians for an invasion they knew was coming. The propaganda they deployed wasn't random. It was systematic, psychological, and devastatingly effective. To understand why thousands of Japanese civilians chose death over capture, we need to go back to the propaganda architecture that shaped their reality. This wasn't accidental messaging. This was a deliberate, government-orchestrated psychological campaign designed to prevent surrender at any cost. The term they used was kichiku. It translates roughly to ogre beast or demon beast, and it became the standard way to refer to American soldiers in government propaganda, military training, and civilian education. But kichiku wasn't just a word. It came packaged with specific, visceral imagery about what these ogre beasts would do to captured civilians. The stories were detailed. Americans would rape women. This was emphasized constantly. They would gouge out eyes. They would cut off ears and noses. They would run people over with tanks while they were still alive. They would torture children in front of their parents. They would desecrate bodies and commit atrocities so horrible that death was preferable to witnessing them, let alone experiencing them. This messaging came from the highest levels of government. Prime Minister Tojo Hideki himself promoted the concept of Ichioku Gyokusai, which means the entire Japanese population, all 100 million people, should be prepared to die. Not just soldiers, everyone. Men, women, children, the elderly. The message was clear and repeated. Constantly dying for the emperor was the highest honor, and falling into enemy hands should be prevented at any cost. Schools taught this. Military officers reinforced it. Local authorities spread it through communities. By the time American forces approached Okinawa in March of 1945, an entire civilian population had been psychologically prepared for mass suicide rather than surrender. Here's what makes this particularly devastating. The propaganda worked because it built on existing cultural frameworks about honor, duty, and shame. Japanese military culture had strict codes about surrender. For soldiers, capture was considered deeply shameful. Extending that framework to civilians wasn't a huge leap. It just required convincing people that capture was worse than death, and that dying while resisting served the emperor. The government didn't just tell people what Americans would do. They told them what they should do in response. Civilians were taught that suicide was honorable, that killing your family members to spare them from capture was an act of love, and that anyone who surrendered was a traitor not just to the nation, but to their ancestors and descendants. When the Battle of Okinawa began, this propaganda faced its first real test on a massive scale. Okinawa was different from previous battles because it had a large civilian population, around 500,000 people living on the island. This wasn't a remote military outpost. These were communities with families, schools, farms, entire towns full of people who'd been hearing about American atrocities for months or years. As American forces advanced, the Japanese military began distributing hand grenades to civilians. Think about that for a moment. Not just to soldiers, but to ordinary people, farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, children. The grenades came with instructions. When the Americans arrive, pull the pin, die with honor. Take your family with you. And people did. Survivors testified that families gathered together, held their children close, and detonated grenades. Others jumped from cliffs in the southern part of the island, entire groups throwing themselves into the ocean rather than face capture. Some strangled family members before killing themselves. Others used whatever weapons they had, knives, farm tools, anything that could end a life. The survivor I mentioned earlier, the one whose father removed her grenade, described the atmosphere in those final days. Everyone said the same thing, over and over: never be a prisoner, never be a prisoner. It became a mantra. Repeated so often, it stopped being a choice and became something closer to a reflex. When capture was inevitable, you died. That was simply what you did. But here's where the propaganda met reality in the most jarring way possible. Some civilians did survive. Some were too injured to kill themselves. Some were separated from their families and captured before they could act. Some, like the survivor whose father saved her, had the means of suicide taken away without their knowledge. And those survivors encountered something completely unexpected. They met Americans who gave them food and water, who provided medical treatment, who didn't rape them, didn't gouge out their eyes, didn't torture them, who seemed genuinely shocked and horrified by the civilian deaths, who asked, through translators, why people were killing themselves instead of surrendering. One survivor recalled being in a group of civilians hiding in a cave system. They'd been there for days, waiting for the Americans to find them so they could trigger the group suicide they'd planned. Then, a Japanese officer appeared. He'd been separated from his unit and had disguised himself in civilian clothing to avoid identification. He'd encountered American forces and survived. He told the group something that contradicted everything they'd been taught. He said the United States Army does not kill civilians. He said they couldn't continue living in constant terror. He said they should surrender. Some people in that cave believed him. Others thought he was lying or had been brainwashed. The group split. Those who surrendered survived and later testified about their treatment. Those who didn't eventually died from starvation or were killed when the caves were cleared by flamethrowers and explosives. This pattern repeated across Okinawa. Civilians who survived the initial wave of suicides often described being surprised at the comparatively humane treatment they received from American forces. That word keeps appearing in testimonies: surprised. They'd been prepared for torture and atrocity. They encountered soldiers who gave them rations and set up refugee camps. Now, I want to pause here because this is where the historical record gets complicated. The propaganda was clearly false in its most extreme claims. Americans were not systematically torturing and murdering civilians, but that doesn't mean no crimes occurred. War crimes absolutely happened. Sexual assault cases were documented. Violence against civilians occurred. The debate among historians isn't about whether any crimes happened. It's about the scale and how those crimes compare to what civilians had been told to expect. We'll dig into those debates in detail later because they're important and unresolved. For now, what matters is understanding the psychological impact of this gap between expectation and reality. Imagine being taught your entire life that a certain group of people are monsters. Imagine being so convinced of this that you're prepared to kill yourself and your family to avoid them. And then imagine discovering that the truth was far more complex. Some survivors experienced this as relief. Others experienced it as betrayal. They'd been lied to by their own government, their own military, their own community leaders. People they'd trusted had convinced them to do things or to witness things that couldn't be undone. Family members were dead because of propaganda that turned out to be exaggerated or false. This psychological devastation rippled through Japanese society for decades. The propaganda campaign that was designed to prevent surrender and maintain fighting spirit ended up creating a generation of trauma survivors who had to reconcile what they'd been told with what they'd experienced. The gap wasn't small, it was enormous. And filling that gap with understanding required confronting some deeply uncomfortable truths about how governments manipulate populations during wartime. The Japanese government knew what they were doing. This wasn't accidental messaging that got out of hand. This was calculated psychological warfare directed at their own population. They needed civilians to resist, to die if necessary, to never surrender, because every civilian death slowed the American advance and made the invasion more costly. The propaganda served a military purpose. The cost was measured in civilian lives, lives that were expendable in the service of a losing war. Let me give you some numbers to make this concrete. Between 100,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians died during the campaign. That's somewhere between 20 and 30% of the entire civilian population of the island. Many of those deaths were from combat artillery, bombs, crossfire between military forces, but a significant portion, historians estimate, thousands, though exact numbers, are impossible to determine, were suicides or murder-suicides directly caused by the propaganda campaign. Those are families, parents killing children, children watching parents die, communities wiping themselves out in caves and on cliff tops because they'd been convinced that death was preferable to capture. And all of it was based on information that ranged from exaggerated to entirely false. The propaganda didn't stop with Okinawa. As the war drew closer to the Japanese mainland, the government intensified their messaging. The same techniques that had been tested on Okinawa were prepared for deployment across the entire country. The plan was for every Japanese civilian to resist. Every town was to become a battlefield. Every person was expected to die rather than surrender. This was the context when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was the psychological state of the Japanese population when Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender in August 1945. People had been prepared for mass suicide. The infrastructure was in place. The grenades had been distributed. The propaganda had done its work. The surrender prevented that apocalyptic scenario. But it also created a massive psychological problem. What happens to a population that's been prepared to die when suddenly they're told to live? What happens when the ogre beasts they'd been taught to fear start walking through their streets, not as conquerors bringing torture and death, but as occupation forces with different orders and different behaviors? That's where we're going next. The occupation created situations so psychologically bizarre, so contrary to everything people expected, that it broke the propaganda framework completely. And nowhere is that contradiction more clear than in what happened to Japanese prisoners of war in American camps while their countrymen starved back home. But first, let me ask you something. Drop a comment below if you've ever believed something so strongly that you'd act on it without question, only to discover later that the truth was completely different. How did that feel? What did it do to your trust in the sources that gave you that false information? Because that's the experience we're about to explore, except multiplied by millions of people and involving life and death decisions. If you're learning something new about World War II history, hit that subscribe button. I cover historical topics that challenge simple narratives and dig into the complex, often uncomfortable truths that textbooks leave out. This channel is about understanding humanity in extreme circumstances, and there's no more extreme circumstance than discovering your entire worldview was built on propaganda. Let's talk about starvation, because that's the context for everything that comes next. In early 1946, the average Tokyo resident was surviving on 775 calories per day. Let me put that in perspective. The average adult needs around 2,000 calories daily to maintain basic function. 1,500 calories is generally considered the starvation threshold, where your body begins breaking down muscle tissue for energy. 775 calories is roughly 1/3 of what you need to survive long term. This wasn't for a few days or weeks. This was for 6 months straight. Tokyo residents failed to receive a full month's ration in 6 out of 12 months during 1946. When rations did arrive, they often consisted of beans instead of rice, and people had to bring their own bottles to transport clean water because infrastructure had been destroyed by bombing campaigns. The calorie decline had been gradual but devastating. Before Pearl Harbor, Japanese consumption averaged around 2,000 calories per capita. By 1944, that had dropped to 1,900. By war's end, in August 1945, it had plummeted to 1,680. Then, in the chaos of occupation, it got even worse before it got better. Official rations were set at 1,793 calories daily in 1945, but those rations were rarely delivered regularly or in full. The average Tokyo resident only acquired 70% of their allocated rations. That's how you get to 775 calories, the gap between what the government promised and what people actually received. Let me paint a more specific picture of what daily life looked like during this crisis. Families would wake before dawn to stand in line at distribution centers. Sometimes the line stretched for blocks. People brought stools or boxes to sit on because the wait could last hours. When you finally reached the front of the line, you might discover the rice hadn't arrived. Instead, you'd receive beans or dried fish or sweet potato stems, whatever substitute the government had available. Water was another constant challenge. Bombing campaigns had destroyed much of the urban infrastructure, including water treatment facilities and distribution pipes. People had to carry bottles or containers to designated locations where clean water was available. This added hours to each day, time spent just acquiring the basics of survival. Mothers faced impossible decisions. When food was scarce, who ate first? The children who needed nutrients to grow? The father who was working to earn money for the black market? The elderly grandparents who'd lived through previous hardships? These weren't theoretical questions. These were daily realities that tore families apart emotionally, even when they tried to share equally. The psychological impact of constant hunger is hard to overstate for people who've never experienced it. Hunger doesn't just make you weak physically, it dominates your thoughts. You can't concentrate on anything else. Children couldn't focus in school because they were thinking about food. Adults couldn't work efficiently because malnutrition sapped their energy. Entire communities moved in a fog of semi-starvation that lasted months. The black market offered an escape for those who could afford it. Rice that cost pennies through official rations might cost a week's wages on the black market. People sold family heirlooms, kimonos that had been passed down for generations, jewelry, artwork, anything of value to buy food. The desperation created a parallel economy where traditional forms of wealth became suddenly worthless and food became the only currency that mattered. Let me read you a testimony from a Japanese food scholar describing what daily life was like. From 1944 on, even in the countryside, school athletic grounds were converted into sweet potato fields. We ate every part of the sweet potato plant, the potatoes themselves, but also the leaves, the stems, everything. For protein, we ate beetles, beetle larvae, and other insects we found at the roots of the plants. School athletic grounds, places where children used to play sports, were dug up and turned into emergency food production. And even then, people weren't eating sweet potatoes as a side dish. They were eating the entire plant, including parts that have almost no nutritional value, just to have something to put in their stomachs. The beetles and larvae weren't delicacies. They were protein sources that could be found if you dug in the right places and were desperate enough to eat them. In urban areas, the situation was even more desperate. Cities had been targeted by American bombing campaigns, destroying not just military infrastructure, but also transportation networks, warehouses, and distribution systems. Even when food existed somewhere in Japan, getting it to Tokyo or other major cities became nearly impossible. People stood in line for hours to receive their rations. Sometimes the rations didn't come. Sometimes they came, but consisted of low-quality goods or substitutes. The black market flourished, but prices were astronomical, and most people couldn't afford it. Starvation was becoming a real possibility for millions of Japanese civilians. Here's the number that puts everything in perspective. American food shipments saved an estimated 10 million Japanese from starvation in fall and winter of 1945 through 46. 10 million people. That's roughly 10% of Japan's entire population at the time. Without American intervention, without the occupation forces bringing in food supplies, millions of Japanese civilians would have died after the war ended. Think about that irony for a moment. The people who'd been taught that Americans were ogre beasts, the people who'd been prepared to die rather than surrender, were saved from starvation by the same military forces they'd been taught to fear. The cognitive dissonance must have been absolutely crushing. Now, let's contrast that with what was happening to Japanese prisoners of war in American camps at the exact same time, because the gap between these two realities reveals something profound about the propaganda machine we discussed earlier. Japanese prisoners of war in American camps received between 2,000 and 2,850 calories per day. Let me repeat that. Between 2,000 and 2,850 calories per day. That's more than American civilians received under wartime rationing back in the United States. That's more than British civilians received during the worst years of the war. And it's nearly 4 times what Tokyo residents were surviving on in 1946. But it wasn't just calories. Japanese POWs received identical medical and dental treatment to that provided to United States troops. When they got sick, they saw the same doctors using the same medicines. When they needed dental work, they got it. The Geneva Conventions required this, and American camps generally followed those requirements. They were paid 80 cents per day for their labor. That money could be used at the camp's post-exchange to purchase Coca-Cola, beer, tobacco, candy, and other items. Think about that. Japanese prisoners in American camps had access to consumer goods that didn't exist in most of Japan at that time. Let me take you inside one specific camp, because the details reveal just how stark this contrast really was. Camp McCoy in Wisconsin held 2,700 Japanese prisoners at its peak. The camp records and survivor testimonies paint a picture that would be almost unbelievable if it weren't so thoroughly documented. Prisoners at Camp McCoy planted traditional Japanese gardens. They weren't forced to do this, they chose to because they wanted something familiar, something that reminded them of home. They built Buddhist shrines where they could practice their religion. They created artificial flowers using colored crepe paper and wire, elaborate decorations that they used to beautify their living quarters. They constructed tennis courts and played regular matches. Every week, prisoners were taken to local movie theaters under guard to watch films. They saw Hollywood movies, newsreels, cartoons. They were exposed to American popular culture in a way that most Japanese civilians would never experience. Some learned English. Many became fascinated by American technology and consumer goods they encountered. Before capture, 84% of these men expected they would be tortured and killed. They'd been taught the same propaganda as Okinawan civilians. They believed they would face unspeakable horrors. Instead, they found themselves playing tennis, watching movies, and drinking Coca-Cola. The psychological impact was profound. Many prisoners became cooperative during interrogations, not because of torture or threats, but because they felt they owed favors to their captors. The food, clothing, and medical treatment created a sense of obligation. In Japanese culture, receiving such generosity requires reciprocation. These men felt indebted to the people they'd been taught to view as monsters. Survivor testimonies from Japanese POWs often describe their imprisonment with what can only be called genuine fondness. Some expressed desires to fight alongside their former enemies. Some said they'd learned more about democracy and freedom during their imprisonment than they'd ever known in Japan. Some struggled with the idea of returning home because they knew the reality waiting for them. Starvation, destroyed cities, a shattered economy. Compare that to what American prisoners experienced in Japanese camps, because the contrast reveals the full scope of this tragedy. Over 27,000 American POWs were held in Japanese camps during the war. Those men faced daily starvation, often receiving fewer than 300 calories per day in the worst camps. They were beaten regularly. They were tortured. They were forced to labor under brutal conditions, and they died in staggering numbers. The mortality rate for American POWs in Japanese camps exceeded 40%. More than 11,000 American prisoners died in Japanese captivity. They died from starvation, from untreated diseases, from execution, from being worked to death. The conditions were so horrific that survivors spent the rest of their lives dealing with trauma that couldn't be adequately treated with the psychological resources available at the time. That's the contrast. Japanese prisoners in American camps playing tennis and watching movies, while American prisoners in Japanese camps were starving and dying by the thousands. Both sides had propaganda but only one side's propaganda bore any resemblance to reality. Now, I need to address something important here. This comparison doesn't absolve American forces of all wrongdoing during the war or occupation. War crimes occurred. Civilians were killed in bombing campaigns that targeted urban areas. The atomic bombs killed hundreds of thousands of people, most of them civilians. The comparison isn't meant to say Americans were perfect. It's meant to show how propaganda distorts reality to the point where people make decisions based on completely false information. The Japanese prisoners in American camps had been taught they would face torture and death. That was false. American prisoners in Japanese camps probably expected they'd be treated according to international law. That turned out to be false too, but in the opposite direction. Both sides had gaps between expectation and reality, but the gaps ran in very different directions. Let's talk about what happened when Japan surrendered and American forces began the occupation, because that's where things get even more complex and where historical debates become most heated. The official policy of the United States occupation forces was clear. Troops were forbidden from assaulting Japanese civilians. Orders came from the highest levels of command. General Douglas MacArthur, who led the occupation as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, made it explicit that mistreating civilians would not be tolerated. But official policy and actual behavior don't always align, especially when you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of young men who've been fighting a brutal war for years and are now stationed in a defeated enemy nation. This is where we have to confront some uncomfortable facts and ongoing historical debates. Starting September 10, 1945, SCAP implemented strict censorship forbidding publication of reports about rape or other crimes committed by occupation forces. That censorship is a documented fact. It happened. The question historians debate is what it was censoring, how many crimes actually occurred versus how many were reported versus how many might have been exaggerated or fabricated. One view, promoted by historians like Tanaka and Dower, points to Japanese police records showing 1,336 reported cases of rape in Kanagawa Prefecture alone over a 10-day period from August 30th to September 10th, 1945. These accounts include gang rapes and attacks on pregnant women. If accurate, those numbers represent a horrific wave of sexual violence during the early days of occupation. But another view, recently argued by historian Brian Walsh, claims that 1,336 number is a misreading of the original Japanese documents. Walsh says the document actually listed 1,326 crimes of all types over 12 days, not just rapes. He argues that rape was uncommon throughout the occupation and occurred at lower rates than in occupied Germany. I've looked at the sources both sides cite, and here's what I can tell you with confidence. Both historians are working from actual documents. Both are trying to understand what really happened, and they've reached genuinely different conclusions based on how they interpret those documents. This isn't a case of one person lying and one telling the truth. This is a case of historical interpretation being incredibly difficult when you're dealing with censored records, language barriers, and events that happened 80 years ago. What we know for certain is this. Official policy forbade crimes. Censorship prevented reporting of crimes. Some crimes definitely occurred. Survivor testimony confirms this. The extent remains contested among professional historians. For Okinawa specifically, some historians estimate United States troops committed thousands of rapes among the Ryukyu Islands population during the campaign and early occupation. Official records show 76 reported rape cases in the first 5 years, though most cases likely went unreported given the social stigma and lack of avenues for justice. Here's another documented fact that provides context. Japan set up the Recreation and Amusement Association, known as RAA, immediately after the surrender. This was essentially a government-organized brothel system designed specifically for occupation forces. Why did they do this? Because Japanese authorities feared mass rape based on what had happened in other occupied territories and what their own military had done in occupied China and Korea. The RAA operated from August through January of 1946 when it was shut down by American military authorities. When it closed, there was a brief spike in reported rapes, then numbers declined. What does that tell us? It's complicated. Some interpret it as evidence the system was preventing worse violence. Others interpret it as evidence that organized sexual exploitation created a culture that enabled assault. Both interpretations have some validity. This is uncomfortable territory, and I want to be clear about what I'm doing here. I'm not defending crimes that occurred. I'm not minimizing sexual violence. What I'm trying to do is show you how even 80 years later, with extensive records and survivor testimony available, historians still can't agree on the full scope of what happened. That's how effective propaganda and censorship can be. They make truth itself contested. What's not contested is the comparison to the propaganda that caused mass civilian suicides. Japanese civilians were told Americans would systematically rape, torture, and murder them. Some rapes definitely occurred. Some murders occurred. But systematic torture and murder of civilians as standard operating procedure, that didn't happen. The propaganda was false in its most extreme claims, even if some criminal acts did occur. American food shipments saved 10 million Japanese from starvation. American medical personnel treated civilians for diseases and injuries. American authorities established schools, rebuilt infrastructure, and implemented reforms that included women's suffrage and land redistribution. Those are also documented facts. The reality was complicated. Crimes occurred alongside humanitarian aid. Violence coexisted with reconstruction. Some American soldiers assaulted civilians, while other American soldiers were saving civilian lives through medical treatment and food distribution. Both things happened. Both are true. And any attempt to reduce this history to simple narratives about heroes or villains misses the messy, contradictory reality of human behavior during occupation. Now, let me introduce one more element that reveals just how strange this period was: Coca-Cola. Because the story of how Coca-Cola arrived in Japan during the occupation tells you something profound about American culture, military logistics, and the collision of two completely different worlds. 6 dismantled Coca-Cola bottling plants were waiting off the coast of Japan at war's end, ready to follow troops ashore. Think about that for a moment. The war was still being fought. The outcome wasn't certain. People were dying by the thousands. And somebody, somewhere in American military planning, made sure there would be Coca-Cola bottling facilities ready to deploy the moment Japan surrendered. This wasn't about refreshment. This was about culture. The Coca-Cola Company had made a vow during World War II: any American in uniform should be able to get a Coke for 5 cents wherever they were in the world. That promise required building bottling stations across the Pacific, across Europe, anywhere American forces were deployed. It was a massive logistical undertaking that ran parallel to the actual war effort. By October 1946, the United States military had built a factory in Okinawa to manufacture Coca-Cola specifically for military use. 1 month later, in November, United Press reported that Coca-Cola has been bottled in Japan for some time, confirming that the drink had become an established part of occupation culture even before any official market entry. For Japanese prisoners in American camps, Coca-Cola bottles became symbols of a world beyond the battlefield. These men had grown up in a militarized society where luxury consumer goods barely existed. They'd been taught that materialism was weak, that sacrifice and duty were the highest values, that wanting comfort meant you lacked martial spirit. Then they encountered Americans who thought it was important enough to dedicate military resources to it, that soldiers could buy a cold Coke for 5 cents, even in the middle of a war zone. The cognitive dissonance was enormous. Some Japanese prisoners described this as their first encounter with the idea that ordinary people could expect comfort and pleasure as normal parts of life. They'd been taught that hardship built character, that suffering proved loyalty. Americans seemed to believe that even in war, people deserved small moments of enjoyment. It was a fundamentally different philosophy, expressed through something as simple as a soft drink. This cultural collision played out in countless small ways during the occupation. Japanese civilians who'd been eating beetles and potato leaves encountered American soldiers casually discarding food they didn't want. The sheer abundance was shocking. Even with rationing in place, Americans operated with assumptions about food availability that seemed impossible to people who'd been starving. The consumer goods Americans took for granted, tobacco, candy, chocolate, chewing gum, became valuable currency in post-war Japan. Children would follow American soldiers hoping for handouts. Adults would trade family heirlooms for American cigarettes. A Hershey bar could be worth a week's wages on the black market. This wasn't just about material wealth. It was about two different visions of what life should be. The Japanese system had emphasized collective sacrifice, military virtue, and submission to authority. The American system, for all its flaws and contradictions, had room for individual pleasure, consumer choice, and the idea that even soldiers at war deserved access to the small comforts of home. That philosophical gap shows up everywhere when you study the occupation. Take the question of democracy. American occupation authorities pushed hard for democratic reforms in Japan. They wrote a new constitution that included women's suffrage, land reform, and limits on military power. These reforms were imposed by a foreign military, which creates an interesting paradox, being forced to be free. Many Japanese intellectuals and reformers welcomed these changes. They'd wanted democratic reforms for decades but had been suppressed by their own military government. The occupation gave them the opportunity to implement ideas that would have been impossible otherwise. Women gained the right to vote in 1945. Land reforms broke up the feudal system that had persisted. For centuries, labor unions became legal. These weren't small changes. They transformed Japanese society in profound ways. But the changes also came from the barrel of a gun, so to speak. Japan didn't choose democracy through internal revolution. It was imposed by occupation forces after a devastating military defeat. That creates complicated dynamics that persist even today in debates about Japanese national identity and sovereignty. Some Japanese embraced American culture enthusiastically. They saw it as liberation from a military dictatorship that had led them into a disastrous war. Others saw it as cultural imperialism, a foreign power forcing its values onto a defeated nation. Both perspectives have validity. Both coexisted during the occupation, sometimes within the same person's mind. Let me give you an example of this contradiction. Some of the same Japanese prisoners who grew fond of their treatment in American camps, who learned to love baseball and Coca-Cola and Hollywood movies, also struggled with deep shame about having surrendered. They'd violated everything they'd been taught about honor and duty. The better they were treated, the more complex their emotions became. Gratitude mixed with shame, relief mixed with guilt, admiration for their captors mixed with loyalty to the culture that had taught them those captors were monsters. Here's a specific case that illustrates this psychological complexity. One Japanese prisoner at Camp McCoy had been a schoolteacher before the war. He'd taught his students about Bushido, the way of the warrior, emphasizing loyalty, honor, and the shame of surrender. He told them stories about samurai who chose death over dishonor. He'd internalized these values so deeply that when he was captured, his first thought was suicide. But the camp commanders at McCoy had other plans. They needed educated prisoners who could help with translation and administrative work. They offered him a job teaching English to other prisoners. At first, he refused. Teaching for the enemy felt like betrayal. But as weeks turned into months, as he saw how other prisoners were treated, as he received regular meals and medical care and wages for his labor, something shifted. He started teaching, not just English, but American history, civics, democratic principles. He became fascinated by concepts he'd never encountered in Japan: individual rights, freedom of speech, government by consent of the governed. He read American newspapers and magazines. He watched Hollywood movies that depicted ordinary people questioning authority, making their own choices, pursuing happiness as they defined it. By the time the war ended, he'd become what we might call today a convert to democratic ideals. he didn't want to go back to Japan. He petitioned to stay in the United States. His request was, denied repatriation was mandatory for all prisoners. But when he did return to Japan in late 1946, he brought with him books, pamphlets, and copies of the American Constitution he'd been given by camp administrators. He spent the rest of his life teaching in Japanese schools again, but his message had changed. He still taught about Japanese culture and history, but he also taught about democracy, about questioning authority, about the importance of individual conscience. Some of his former colleagues called him a traitor, others called him a visionary. He called himself someone who'd learned uncomfortable truths and couldn't unlearn them. That's the psychological journey many prisoners experienced, compressed into one man's story. The shame never fully disappeared. He'd surrendered when he'd been taught that death was preferable. But the education he received in captivity transformed his understanding of what life could be, what society could be, what values deserved loyalty. This wasn't unique to Camp McCoy. Similar transformations happened at camps across the United States. Prisoners who entered expecting death and torture left understanding democracy, individual rights, and the possibility of societies built on different principles than the ones they'd grown up with. Some rejected these ideas upon returning to Japan. Others became advocates for the democratic reforms the occupation was implementing. The psychological impact rippled through Japanese society for decades. This psychological complexity extended to Japanese civilians during the occupation. They needed American food to survive, which created dependence on the people they'd been taught to hate. They appreciated the rebuilding efforts, the schools, the hospitals, but they also resented being a defeated, occupied nation. They were fascinated by American culture but worried about losing their own traditions. These contradictions never fully resolved. They became part of post-war Japanese identity, a nation that had been devastated and then rebuilt by the same people who defeated them. A nation that had to reconcile the propaganda about ogre beasts with the reality of occupation forces who fed them and implemented democratic reforms. Now, let's return to the scholarly debates about crimes during the occupation, because this is where historical interpretation gets most complicated and most important. The debate between different historians about sexual violence during the occupation isn't just academic. It matters for how we understand the occupation, how we understand American military conduct, and how we understand the relationship between official policy and actual behavior. Brian Walsh's recent argument challenges a narrative that's been accepted by many historians for decades. He's saying the 1,336 rapes in Kanagawa's story is based on a misreading of Japanese documents. If he's right, that's significant. It means the early occupation was less violent than some histories have claimed. It means the gap between propaganda and reality was even larger than previously thought. But his argument hasn't been universally accepted. Other historians have pushed back, arguing that their interpretation of the documents is correct and that Walsh is minimizing real violence that occurred. They point to survivor testimony, to the establishment of the RAA brothel system as evidence that Japanese authorities expected mass violence, and to the censorship regime that prevented accurate reporting. Who's right? I've read arguments from both sides, and here's my honest assessment. Both sides are working in good faith with actual historical documents. Both are trying to understand what really happened. And they've reached different conclusions because the evidence is incomplete and interpretation matters enormously when dealing with translated documents from a censored period 80 years ago. What does that tell us? It tells us that even with extensive research, even with access to archives and survivor testimony, even with decades of historical scholarship, some aspects of history remain contested. The truth is complex, and sometimes beyond our ability to fully determine. This is important because it relates directly to our central theme, propaganda versus reality. The Japanese propaganda said Americans would systematically rape and torture civilians. That was false. But saying it was false doesn't mean no rapes occurred. Some definitely did. The question is scale. Were we talking about widespread, Systematic violence? Or were we talking about criminal acts by some individuals that violated official policy? That distinction matters for understanding the occupation. It matters for understanding American military conduct. And it matters for understanding how propaganda works. Because one of propaganda's most effective techniques is mixing truth with lies in ways that make the entire message believable. If the Japanese propaganda had been entirely false, if literally no American soldier had ever committed a crime against a civilian, it would have been easier to dismiss. But some crimes did occur. That kernel of truth made the exaggerated propaganda more believable. People could point to actual incidents and say, "See, the propaganda was right," even though the propaganda had taken isolated incidents and inflated them into a systematic policy of atrocity. This technique appears in propaganda systems throughout history. You take a real problem, a real incident, a real fear, and you amplify it until it becomes unrecognizable. You add details. You make it more extreme. You present it as universal when it's actually rare. And by the time you're done, people can't distinguish between the kernel of truth and the elaborate fiction you've built around it. The Japanese military used this technique brilliantly. They took the reality that war involves violence, that occupying forces sometimes commit crimes, that terrible things happen in combat, and they inflated it into a narrative about ogre beasts who systematically torture everyone they encounter. The technique worked because it built on real fears and real possibilities, then pushed them to extremes. Understanding this technique matters for our current moment. We live in an age of information warfare, where propaganda has become more sophisticated than ever. The same techniques that convinced Japanese civilians to commit mass suicide are being used today to shape public opinion, influence elections, and manipulate populations. The specific claims are different, but the psychological mechanisms remain identical. You take a real problem, you amplify it, you add extreme details, you make it seem universal and inevitable. You connect it to people's existing fears and cultural values. You repeat it constantly through every available channel. And eventually, many people accept it as truth, even when the reality is far more complex. This is why studying historical propaganda isn't just about understanding the past. It's about developing the critical thinking skills to recognize manipulation in the present. When you see how Japanese civilians were convinced that surrender meant torture and death, you start to recognize similar patterns in contemporary messaging. What would have happened if more Japanese civilians had questioned the propaganda? What if they'd asked for evidence, looked for contradictory information, talked to people who'd actually encountered Americans? Some did. The officer who told civilians the United States Army doesn't kill civilians had figured it out. Some survivors questioned the official narrative and survived because of that skepticism. But most people didn't question. They accepted what they were told by authorities they trusted. And that acceptance led to tragedy on a massive scale. Tens of thousands of people died because they believed lies told by their own government. The uncomfortable truth is that we're all vulnerable to this. We all trust certain sources. We all have beliefs we've accepted without thoroughly examining the evidence. We all have narratives about the world that shape how we interpret new information. The Japanese civilians who believed the propaganda weren't stupid or uniquely gullible. They were human beings responding to information from trusted sources during an extremely stressful time. That's the lesson here. Not that propaganda is bad. We all know propaganda is bad. The lesson is that propaganda works on normal, intelligent people when it comes from trusted sources and confirms existing fears. The only defense is constant skepticism, checking multiple sources, and being willing to update your beliefs when new evidence appears. The Japanese prisoners who discovered their beliefs about American atrocities were wrong had to go through that updating process. It was psychologically devastating for many of them. Their entire worldview had been built on lies. Confronting that reality meant confronting their own gullibility, their own complicity in spreading those lies, their own responsibility for acting on false information. But they did it. They updated their beliefs. they accepted the new reality. And many of them became advocates for peace, for questioning authority, for seeking truth even when it's uncomfortable. The trauma of discovering they'd been manipulated became, for some, a source of wisdom about how propaganda works and why resisting it matters. That's where we're heading in the conclusion. What does this history teach us? What can we learn from the gap between propaganda and reality? And how do we apply those lessons to our own time, when propaganda has become more sophisticated and more pervasive than anything the Japanese military could have imagined in 1945? But before we get there, I want to hear from you. Have you ever encountered a situation where what you were told turned out to be completely different from reality? How did you handle that? Did it change how you evaluate information going forward? Drop a comment below, because this isn't just historical discussion. This is about how we all navigate truth and lies in our daily lives. If this deep dive into propaganda and reality has been valuable, hit that subscribe button and click the bell. I'm covering historical topics that challenge simple narratives and force us to confront complexity. The algorithms don't always love nuanced history, so subscribing and sharing helps this content reach people who are hungry for depth instead of sound bites. Let's bring this home with the lessons that matter most. You started this video with a simple question. What was the gap between propaganda and reality for Japanese civilians and prisoners during World War II? You now know the answer is far more complex than any simple narrative could capture. You learned that Japanese civilians were taught Americans were kichiku, ogre beasts who would rape, torture, and murder them. That propaganda was so effective that tens of thousands of people killed themselves and their families rather than face capture. You discovered that survivors who encountered actual Americans were often shocked at the comparatively humane treatment they received, creating psychological devastation as they realized they'd been lied to by their own government. You explored the starvation crisis that had Tokyo residents surviving on 775 calories per day, while Japanese prisoners in American camps received 2,850 calories, played tennis, watched movies, and drank Coca-Cola from vending machines. You confronted the stark contrast between American POWs who died by the thousands from starvation and torture in Japanese camps and Japanese POWs who described their American imprisonment with genuine fondness. You investigated the occupation period, where official American policy forbade crimes against civilians, but some crimes definitely occurred, creating ongoing debates among historians about the scale and nature of violence during that period. You saw how censorship makes historical truth difficult to determine even 80 years later, with extensive archives and survivor testimony available. And you discovered how something as simple as a Coca-Cola bottle became a symbol of cultural collision, representing a world of consumer abundance and individual comfort that Japanese civilians had never imagined existed. But what does all of this mean? What lessons can we extract from this history that matter for understanding our own world? Because this isn't just about 1945. This is about how propaganda works in any era, including right now in 2025. Here's what you need to know to protect yourself from modern psychological manipulation. First, propaganda works by mixing truth with lies in ways that make the entire narrative believable. The Japanese military propaganda about American atrocities wasn't entirely fabricated. War does involve violence. Occupation forces do sometimes commit crimes. Those kernels of truth made the exaggerated propaganda more credible. People could point to possibilities and treat them as certainties. The technique is timeless and still appears in every modern propaganda system, from political campaigns to social media algorithms to corporate marketing. Second, the gap between expectation and reality can be psychologically devastating. Japanese prisoners expected torture and death. They received food, medical care, and tennis courts. That gap didn't create simple relief. It created complex trauma as people confronted their own gullibility and the lies they'd believed. Updating your worldview when confronted with contradictory evidence is painful, but it's essential for intellectual and emotional growth. Third, official policy and actual behavior don't always align. And that gap creates historical complexity that resists simple narratives. American occupation policy forbade crimes. Some crimes occurred anyway. Both facts are true simultaneously. Any historical account that ignores either fact is incomplete. Nuance isn't weakness. It's honesty about the messiness of human behavior. Fourth, suffering creates comparison and perspective that can be almost unbearable. Japanese prisoners who were treated well in American camps while their families starved back home experienced survivor's guilt on a massive scale. They had access to abundance while their loved ones ate beetles and potato leaves. That psychological burden persisted for decades. Comparison isn't just intellectual. It's emotional, and it shapes how we understand justice and fairness. Fifth, cultural assumptions about what normal life should include vary wildly, and those differences reveal fundamental philosophical gaps. Americans thought soldiers deserved Coca-Cola even in war zones. Japanese military culture thought that wanting comfort showed weakness. Both assumptions shaped behavior in profound ways. Understanding different cultural frameworks isn't about declaring one right and one wrong. It's about recognizing that people operate from genuinely different premises about what life should be. Sixth, censorship and propaganda make historical truth difficult to determine, even with extensive evidence. The debates about crimes during the occupation continue because censorship at the time prevented accurate reporting. When you control information, you shape history itself. That power is dangerous and persists long after the events in question. Seventh, vulnerability to propaganda isn't about intelligence. It's about trust and fear. Smart, educated Japanese civilians believed the propaganda because it came from trusted authorities during an extremely frightening time. We're all vulnerable under similar conditions. The defense isn't thinking you're too smart to be fooled. The defense is systematic skepticism, checking multiple sources, and being willing to update beliefs when evidence changes. And finally, the most important lesson: the people we're taught to fear are almost always more complex than the propaganda suggests. Japanese civilians were taught Americans were monsters. American soldiers were taught Japanese were fanatics who'd never surrender. Both sides had propaganda. Both sides had kernels of truth mixed with elaborate lies. The reality involved human beings with full ranges of behavior, some good, some evil, most somewhere in between. That lesson matters urgently right now. We live in an age where propaganda has become more sophisticated, more pervasive, and more effective than anything available in 1945. Social media algorithms amplify extreme messages. Echo chambers reinforce existing beliefs. Information warfare shapes elections and public opinion worldwide. The techniques that convinced Japanese civilians to commit mass suicide are being used every day to manipulate populations on a global scale. The question isn't whether you're being targeted by propaganda. You are. We all are. The question is whether you're developing the critical thinking skills to recognize it and resist it. Are you checking multiple sources? Are you seeking out perspectives that challenge your beliefs? Are you willing to update your worldview when confronted with contradictory evidence? Are you aware of your own confirmation bias and the emotional appeals that bypass rational thinking? These aren't abstract questions. These are daily practices that determine whether you're controlling your beliefs or your beliefs are being controlled by people with agendas you may not even recognize. Here's what I want you to do with this information. First, practice intellectual humility. When you encounter information that confirms what you already believe, that's the moment to be most skeptical. When you encounter information that challenges your beliefs, that's the moment to pay closest attention. The Japanese civilians who questioned the propaganda and survived did so because they were willing to entertain the possibility that trusted authorities were lying. Second, seek out primary sources and multiple perspectives. Don't just read one account of events. Don't rely solely on sources that share your political or cultural perspective. Read historians who disagree with each other. Look at original documents when possible. Develop the habit of asking, "How do we know this?" and who benefits from this narrative. Third, recognize the emotional hooks propaganda uses. Fear is the most powerful motivator. The Japanese propaganda worked because it triggered fear of rape, torture, and death. Modern propaganda uses fear of economic insecurity, cultural change, violence, or loss of status. When you notice fear driving your response to information, pause and examine whether that fear is being manufactured or amplified. Fourth, be willing to say, "I don't know," and the truth is complicated. The historians debating the occupation crimes haven't reached consensus, even with extensive research. That's not a failure. That's an honest recognition that some questions don't have simple answers. Comfortable certainty is often a sign of propaganda working. Uncomfortable uncertainty is often a sign of actual thinking happening. Fifth, study historical propaganda not to feel superior to people who fell for it, but to recognize the same patterns in your own life. You're not smarter than Japanese civilians in 1945. You just have the benefit of hindsight and hopefully access to better information. Use that advantage wisely. And finally, remember that propaganda's most insidious effect isn't making you believe specific lies. It's making you incapable of recognizing truth when it appears. The Japanese civilians who survived often said they were shocked at American humanity. Propaganda had made them unable to recognize kindness and decency when it was right in front of them. Don't let propaganda blind you to complexity and humanity in your own time. The gap between propaganda and reality destroyed families, killed tens of thousands of people, and created psychological trauma that persisted for generations. It didn't happen because people were stupid. It happened because propaganda is powerful, fear is overwhelming, and critical thinking requires constant practice. You now know this history. You understand the mechanisms. You've seen the consequences. What you do with that knowledge determines whether you're vulnerable to the same techniques or equipped to resist them. If this changed how you understand World War II history and propaganda, hit that like button and share this video with history enthusiasts who appreciate deep research over simplified narratives. This video represents weeks of research across 51 authoritative sources, academic journals, government archives, military records, and survivor testimonies. Subscribe for more documentary-style investigations into the complex, uncomfortable truths that textbooks leave out. I cover historical events that challenge simple hero-villain narratives with extensive research and primary sources. And here's the most important question. Drop a comment if you've ever believed something so strongly you'd act on it without question, only to discover the truth was completely different. How did that change your view of propaganda and information sources? Join the conversation. What modern propaganda patterns do you recognize after watching this? How do we protect ourselves from psychological manipulation today? Thank you for spending a full hour with me, exploring one of the most psychologically complex chapters of World War II history. The gap between propaganda and reality is never simple. But understanding that complexity is the first step toward recognizing manipulation and insisting on truth. Remember, this isn't just history. It's a masterclass in how psychological warfare works at scale. Understanding this helps us recognize propaganda patterns in modern media, social movements, and political messaging. The Japanese civilians who said, "Please kill us quickly," were victims of the most devastating propaganda campaign in modern history. We honor them by learning from their tragedy and refusing to be manipulated by fear in our own time. I'll see you in the next one, where we continue exploring the uncomfortable, complicated, essential truths that shape human history and human nature.